Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining this Grantham Institute discussion, Forests and Climate Change, the Pitfalls and Benefits of Reforestation, which is hosted as part of London Climate Action Week. My name is Martin Seagate. I'm the co-director of the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London. We're one of 6 global institutes at Imperial College, and our focus on research, education, innovation and engagement, all about climate change and the environment. Now, we have an exciting hour-long discussion coming up, but first I want to go through a few housekeeping notes for you. We're keen to make this time for questions as much as possible for those watching at home. Now, many of you have already submitted questions to us, but you can also post questions in the comments underneath this video on YouTube. One of my colleagues is going to be keeping an eye out on those and sending me them over toward the end of the session. Remember, you can also like other people's questions, and that will help my team get a sense of the most popular things you want answers to. I'm delighted to introduce 2 guests who will be joining me for this discussion. Bonnie Waring is an ecosystem ecologist and biogeochemist at Imperial College London, who studies the flows of carbon among plants, soils and the atmosphere. She's one of the authors on a new briefing paper on tree planting titled "What Role Can Forests Play in Tackling Climate Change?" And Dwayne Fields is a presenter, naturalist, adventurer and explorer. Dwayne was the first Black Briton to walk over 400 miles to the magnetic North Pole. As a polar scientist myself, I can tell you that is no easy feat. Since then, he's worked on many projects to actively inspire children from various backgrounds to explore the outdoors. He's recently been awarded the Freedom of the City of London for his work with young people, and I know he's planning an expedition to Antarctica next, and of course in due course I look forward to discussing those things with him. Now I'm going to hand over to Bonnie to talk about the new briefing paper from the Grantham Institute, all about forests and tree planting in the context of fighting climate change. You'll be able to find a link to the paper in the event description on YouTube. Bonnie, thanks for joining us. Maybe I could ask you to tell us a bit about the research and what you found out.
All right, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. So recently there's been a huge surge of interest in tree planting as a mechanism to combat climate change. And the purpose of our discussion today is to explore some of the nuances of this so-called nature-based solution to climate change to make sure we can realize the best benefits both for our ecosystems and for society. So how are trees involved in regulating the climate? As you all know, climate change is caused by an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And trees and other green plants are able to convert that carbon dioxide into sugars, which they then use to build leaves, wood, and roots. And this everyday miracle means that forests hold almost half of the organic carbon on land ecosystems. Here in the UK, forests occupy less than 13% of our land area, but they hold, as you can see in this figure, about 1 gigaton, that's 1 billion tons of carbon. Now, what's surprising to most people is actually that most of that carbon is not held in the living body of the tree, the leaves, wood, and roots. Instead, the vast majority of that carbon is locked up in dead wood, dead leaves and roots on the forest floor, but mostly in the soil. So when trees die, their senesced tissues are decomposed by microorganisms that live in the soil. In that process, they naturally convert some of the carbon in that dead wood back into carbon dioxide, but some fraction of it is stabilized in the soil where it can remain from periods of time ranging from years to many centuries. So given the ability of forests to convert atmospheric carbon into more stable forms, it makes sense that planting trees can help draw down atmospheric CO2. But I want to make a critical point here before I explore some of the other facets of this idea, and that is we cannot plant our way out of the carbon crisis with business as usual emissions scenarios. Even if we were to cram trees into every corner of the globe where they could possibly grow, we estimate that they would absorb only about 10 years worth of carbon emissions at current rates, and it would take them about a century to grow large enough to do so. That doesn't mean that planting trees isn't a good idea. As a matter of fact, we need to include tree planting in our portfolio of what we call negative emissions technologies, strategies to draw down CO2 while we simultaneously decrease emissions. And unlike other negative emissions technologies, trees offer really important benefits to the ecosystems in which they reside, to our economy, and to human health and well-being. So if we're considering planting trees at a large scale, we have a couple critical questions to consider. And the first is where to plant them. Next slide, please. So as it turns out, paradoxically, there are parts of the world where planting trees can actually damage the climate. And I'll go through a few examples here. So in the UK, we're lucky enough to have fantastic peatland and bog ecosystems. And these are sites where the soil is extremely wet, so wet that decomposition slows down to a snail's pace. And the vegetation that grows there, when it dies, remains in the soil, and we build up these tremendously thick layers of dead organic matter. In fact, in the UK, there is 20 times more carbon in peatland soils than there is in all of our trees put together. If we plant trees on peatlands, we have to drain them to make the soils dry enough for the trees to grow. That rapidly accelerates decomposition of the peat, and we release more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than the growing trees can absorb. So we really want to avoid planting on peatlands. Another area where we want to avoid planting is savannas and grasslands. These ecosystems are regulated by fire. If we add more trees, the fires get hotter, more intense, and more frequent. And of course, fire converts all of the carbon in those trees we just planted back into CO2. We also want to avoid planting in certain high latitude ecosystems where the climate is now warm enough to support trees. The native vegetation in these ecosystems lies low to the ground, so for most of the year, it's covered in a blanket of snow. And that highly reflective snow reflects the sun's heat back into space. If we plant trees, they're tall, they're dark, they absorb that heat. So we focus on plant trees, is the areas they're already happily growing, tropical forests and temperate forests, like we have here in the UK. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. All right, so another thing that we have to take into account when we're planting trees is which species that we want to plant. And what this figure is showing is a gradient of forest types, ranging from native forests with very little or no management on the one side to intensively managed bioenergy plantations on the other. All of these forest ecosystems types can contribute to regulating the climate, but the mechanisms by which they do so are very different. So another key point that I'd like to discuss today is the need to conserve and protect native forests where they stand, because this has a stronger positive impact on the climate than planting new trees. There's some scientific subtlety to this, which I'm happy to discuss further. But what we know is that existing forests can hold more carbon than plantations. Forests grow the fastest when they're young, but they continue to accumulate carbon even as the forest age approaches many centuries. And a large portion of that carbon, as we discussed earlier, is going into the soil. Native forests also help protect biodiversity and are an incredible cultural resource. However, plantation forests have an important role to play too. So forests managed for production, the main mechanism by which they affect climate is generating harvested wood products that can themselves represent a carbon store. So if we incorporate plantation-derived wood into buildings and other long-lived structures, not only do we avoid generating more fossil fuel-intensive materials like steel, but that carbon itself is preserved for a long period of time. So we want to encourage plantation managers to think about the way that they can start ensuring that the wood flowing from their plantation is used in long-lived products. And a great way to do this is to ensure that we are planting native tree species in diverse mixtures. There's a tremendous amount of ecological research that demonstrates that such species mixtures are somewhat more productive and more resilient to the changes in future climate that our forests will face. And finally, I want to discuss bioenergy, and this is a somewhat contentious topic. The idea here is that if we burn trees for energy, we don't have to burn fossil fuels. And this process is carbon neutral because the CO2 we release from tree burning is incorporated into a new forest as it grows. But of course, that takes time. And so there's a period in between the burning of the old forest and the final growth of the new forest that we refer to as a carbon debt period. And that period is quite long for wood bioenergy as compared to other renewable energy sources like solar or wind. So we want to avoid planting large monocultures, often of exotic species, just for bioenergy. But the residues from the processing of trees for long-lived wood products that could not be incorporated into buildings or other such products can be burned as a source of bioenergy as well. And so with that, I'll hand back to Martin, and I'm really excited to continue discussing these ideas.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Now, we just found out that Dwayne is taking a little bit of time to get a connection good enough to join us right now. So what we're going to do is take a few questions for Bonnie, and I hope that Dwayne can join with us in a few minutes, and I'm sure that will work out. So as I said, we had a few questions that were posted originally on YouTube, and I'm going to run through one or two of these. First is a question from Michael Knapp, and he asks, how are we going to restore Europe's forests when they increasingly suffer from the effects of climate change? Now, I know, Bonnie, that you've worked in lots of areas around the world in North America, advising and thinking about how to plant trees. What are the sort of things that governments might be considering if we're trying to reforest the European continent? What are the sort of scientific things that need to be considered?
So in order for a forest to withstand the many threats that it's going to endure over the next century, we need to be thinking about the forest of 100 years from now today. And that means, first of all, that we need to think about the climatic threats that our forests will face. So we know that Europe is getting warmer. Rainfall regimes are also changing. And so we're going to start to see the need for encouraging drought tolerance and heat tolerance within our tree communities. At the current stage, the far more direct threat is invasive species. And that threat may intensify, especially as the climate changes as well. So we want to be managing our woodlands to ensure that we get proper regeneration. In terms of the ways to do this, I think that much research shows that planting diverse mixtures, and that is in terms of species diversity and also genetic diversity of provenance, where those trees come from, is our best bet. We're essentially having an insurance portfolio effect. We don't know exactly which types of climatic or biotic threats those forests will face in the future, so we want to ensure that we have a lot of genetic diversity in there so that they have a chance to adapt.
How long does it take if we want to create and recreate a natural forest? Say there's an area of forest that has been taken down and we want to return it to its natural state. How long does it take from planting to maturity?
That will depend on the climate. So for instance, we have faster growth in the tropics and also the composition of tree species that are there. True mature forests, what we here call ancient woodlands, can take many centuries to develop their important features, and particularly those that support their associated endemic species. That doesn't mean, though, that we should despair about the timescale involved. It means that we should, in addition to planting new trees, also focus on conserving the ones that are already standing.
I know we've spoken about carbon dioxide as a major driver, but there are lots of other co-benefits as well, aren't there? Do you want to just sort of run through a couple of those things? Yeah, there are lots of reasons, good reasons to plant trees, of course.
Sure. So trees regulate our hydrologic cycles. As a matter of fact, some exciting recent research came out to show that the Amazon forest itself essentially generates its own weather because there's enough trees drawing enough water out of the soil to create clouds overhead, which is completely amazing. Forests are hotspots of the world's biodiversity. The most biodiverse regions of the world are all forests. Here in the UK, many of our rarest and most threatened species are forest dwelling. And then there's really important cultural and mental health benefits to forests as well. I know that Dwayne will be speaking to that. There's research to show that our physical health is actually affected by the presence of natural environments. So patients in hospital rooms that face trees have quicker recovery times than patients whose room faces a brick wall, for instance.
Yeah, indeed. I hope we're going to come to talking about cities and planting trees within the context of urban environments in a short while. Got another question from Harry Grucott, who asked about the standards of verification for the values of carbon in trees. How good are they? You know, how easy is it for us to understand firstly the amount of carbon stored within a tree and the amount of carbon that's being absorbed as well? What are the sort of techniques and things we can use?
It's surprisingly difficult, and I say this as a person who does this for a living. So here in the UK, the Woodland Carbon Code is our attempt to accurately quantify carbon stored in landowners' property when they plant trees. And what we're really looking for is, first of all, changes in carbon in wood and in the soil. And we want to make sure that that carbon would not have accumulated anyway without the landholder's intervention, what we call additionality. And we want to be sure that it's permanent, so that we're not planting trees and then cutting them down 5 years later. So each of those features, the total amount of carbon, its additionality, and how long it lasts, is a separate thing that we need to measure. In terms of quantifying carbon sequestered in the ecosystem, for trees, that's fairly easy. We measure the size of the tree, and we have equations that relate the diameter of the trunk to how much carbon it might contain, but that all varies by species. The soil is really hard. It's a really big pool of carbon. It is really chemically diverse. It's huge and it changes slowly. So the trees are sort of like the speedboat. The soil is like the huge ocean tanker, big but slow. And so quantifying changes in that pool, even though it's incredibly important, poses a challenge.
Now, I know we're all sort of amateur microbiologists at this particular time, right? But microbes have a really important role to play in soils. And they add to the diversity, and this is a specialism for you, of course. Can you just sort of tell us a little bit about that? Because I'm sure people don't really appreciate, you know, how important microbial content is within soils, and how that means that soils are different to each other.
Yeah, so I showed the figure earlier demonstrating that 70% of woodland carbon in the UK is held in the soil. And who determines how much of that carbon is lost back to the atmosphere as respiration and how much stays there? It's the microbes. It depends which species are there and their relative abundance. The amazing thing, if you go out to your back garden right now and take 1 teaspoon of soil, in that teaspoon there will be a couple hundred species of fungi and several thousand species of bacteria. 1 teaspoon. Walk over, you know, a meter away, take another teaspoon, you'll find different species. So we're really trying to grapple as a community with that incredible diversity of microbial life and understand how it affects that balance between soil carbon loss and decomposition and the formation of stable soil carbon from dead trees.
And of course, there are certain types of trees that are well suited to a particular type of soil, and planting trees which aren't suited to that. What would happen to those trees? So you planted a non-native tree in soil that it's not accustomed to. What would be the outcome of that?
Well, it's highly dependent. In the UK, obviously, our most common production tree is Sitka spruce. That is over half of the conifer stands in the UK are that non-native species, and it does just fine. But what we really want to think about is the effects of the tree on the accumulation of soil carbon through time and how the microbes associated with a given species might influence that dynamic. And that's an area of very active research in my lab and many others, and something that we need to understand much better if we're going to start recommending which native species to plant in a given area to maximize soil carbon sequestration.
So I've got a question from Andrew Griffiths, and he says, well, I don't expect you to answer this explicitly, but nonetheless, it's worth investigating. Which are the best tree planting schemes that the general public can trust and donate to as a way to offset personal carbon impact? I don't want necessarily to us list names. So what are the type of things we'd be looking for in a planting scheme that we believe is doing the right thing?
That's a wonderful question. So there's a few very important things that you should check for before you donate your money. The first is, where does this organization get their land? Are they sort of parachuting into an area without strong connections to the local communities? We've shown again and again that that type of tree planting intervention fails. When you put a seedling in the ground and take a photo, that's not the end, that's just the very beginning. For that seedling to survive, it has to withstand droughts. It can't be eaten by anything. We can't have weeds growing up tall and shading it out from the sun. So you need local communities involved who will take care of those seedlings as they grow. So tree planting projects should be embedded in their local communities. That's first. Second, which species are they planting? Are they making an effort to plant native species to that area and in diverse mixtures? Too many of these types of projects are using things that just grow quickly, like eucalyptus or poplar, and those do not have as many environmental benefits as using species native to the area.
Thank you. So I've got another question from Peter Ebson. He says, in terms of use of forests, and we do touch on this in the paper, I believe, how can we utilize industrial timber plantation projects for carbon removal and storage? How useful is that?
They can be extremely useful, but what really matters is what happens to the wood after it's harvested. So obviously, as I mentioned before, we really want to protect native forests where they stand because they contain a lot of carbon. But production forests can continuously generate a flow of timber that, if it's then used in applications where that wood hangs around for 100 years or longer, are also sequestering carbon away from the atmosphere for a fairly long time. Now, as many of the foresters in the audience will know far better than I, there are management techniques that we can apply to ensure that the trees that we're growing are appropriate for those uses. They need to be big enough, the trunks need to be straight, and so if we are thinking about how to make sure a plantation is best serving climate mitigation purposes, the management will really need to be focused on those long-lived wood products. Making toilet paper does not help the planet, unfortunately.
Okay, got a serious question now as well, and I know that a lot of people are thinking about this. Well, I say when they fly, we're not doing too much flying at the moment, and of course it's a very large emitter of carbon dioxide, aviation is, and so many people claim to offset their flying essentially with tree planting. Does it work? Is that something that people can be comfortable with? What are the issues around using tree planting for offsets?
Tree planting has the potential to work as an offset, but we should be cautious because the best mechanism that we have had to do that so far, the so-called RED program, has not been shown to work. So the idea of the RED program is that countries or corporations could compensate landowners for avoiding deforestation or planting trees. And those offsets would then allow the offset buyer to continue their business as usual strategy. There have been some studies recently that have shown that this has not at a large scale led to increases in forest area, and it hasn't in most cases led to enhanced carbon sequestration. This is not because trees don't store carbon, it's because we need buy-in of the people who are taking care of those trees. So some of the issues I touched on previously, for instance, if you plant trees in one area that is being used by people, for instance, to graze cattle, and then they have to go cut down forest next door to continue grazing, well, you haven't changed the net forest area at all. And so these types of offset schemes need to be practiced with extreme caution. Otherwise, they amount essentially to us buying the privilege to feel good while we continue burning carbon without actually turning the needle on the climate.
Yeah, one of the reasons that airlines quite like the idea of offsetting in this way is because it sounds nice and simple, and it makes flying feel sort of guilt-free. But for the issues that you said, it needs to be considered a little bit more carefully than just that. Of course, there's in the United Kingdom, we have a lot of flooding that goes on from time to time. Planting trees in upland locations that can be an excellent way to alleviate some problems with water runoff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the effects of trees on hydrological cycles are complex. It has to do with the architecture of their roots in the soil, and also the way that they themselves use water and transpire. They are also great pollutant filters. So there have been many striking studies to show that planting trees along the sides of waterways, for instance, increases their ability to absorb pollutants from the watercourse.
Good questions coming in now from audience, and one is from Agnes Norris-Keeler. Thanks very much for the interesting webinar. You're very welcome, Agnes. She says, is there much variation in the effectiveness of different tree species as carbon stores? Now, you kind of touched on this previously, but it is a nuanced issue, isn't it? Because it isn't just about the species, it's about how you're planting them and the management of the forest. But just go into some details. And if you had money was no object and you wanted to remove carbon at a fast rate, what would you do? What would be the magic way to deploy forests to remove carbon? What species would you be?
It is a really nuanced issue, and I'll just use the UK kind of as a case study for this. So in the UK, the most common species that we put in plantations are really fast-growing conifers like Sitka spruce. They accumulate biomass really quickly. Our native species are almost all broadleaf trees, and they grow much more slowly, but at maturity, they're bigger and their wood is denser. So at the end of the day, if it's allowed to mature, a broadleaf forest will contain more carbon than a Sitka spruce forest. So the question then of how do we store more carbon? Well, are you intending to harvest that forest? If so, it might make sense to plant something fast growing so that you can get more rotations in a given time window, more wood for long-lived products. But if you just want the forest to exist as a carbon store, then you would definitely want to go with broadleaf trees.
So we've got another question from Judy Lingwong. Hi, Judy. Nice for you to be joining us today. She says, can we comment on the significance of the urban forest and its potential impact of people planting small trees in gardens as part of the tree planting effort? Well, Judy, that's something that I'm very keen to do as well. What is the potential, Bonnie, for people planting trees in very small gardens?
So this is unlikely to have a huge impact on the total amount of carbon contained in the global forest, but it has so many other positive impacts that I think it's a wonderful thing to do. Urban trees purify the air. They reduce local heating, and they can essentially form islands of biodiversity for the other plants and animals that live in the city. So people sort of think of urban environments and natural environments as a dichotomy, but they're not, of course. And so the extent to which we can create green spaces that are used by wildlife, that helps knit together the fabric of our countryside and increases area for those organisms to live. And then, of course, there's the benefits I touched on previously, the tremendous effects on our physical and mental well-being of having green spaces.
I've got another question from Laurie Goering, who asked, and I'm not sure that you might, don't worry if you don't have the direct answer to this, because she's getting a bit political here. How much does UK policy on trees adhere to all the guidance that you've given? In the UK, are we doing the right thing, or are there issues that you know about?
Well, I would, rather than comment explicitly on policy right now, I would just say how important it is for policy makers to be aware of these scientific nuances and to communicate frequently with their stakeholders and with the scientists doing the primary research. So in the 80s and 90s, the last time reforestation of the UK was really a hot topic, the policy encouraged planting trees on peatlands because they didn't have trees on them. And then, of course, we drained the peats and lost more carbon than we gained in the trees. So that mistake has been realized in the intervening time, but it shows the importance of needing to continually update our scientific information base to inform the policy. And in fact, current forest research guidelines say that we should avoid planting on what is called deep peats over 50 centimeter depth, but allow and even encourage planting on the shallow peats. And we don't know what the net carbon effect of that is, because you're still draining a peat soil. Can the trees absorb as much carbon as is released there? It's a gray area. And so that's one example of where we need more science to inform the policy to make sure we're carrying this out in the right way.
I know that in the UK, we do have a 25-year environment plan that was launched a couple of years ago, and it was very good. There was a lot of positivity around that, trying to link in the major scientific understanding of these systems into policy. That it's not policy itself, but it's a mechanism by which policy can be developed. And we do have institutions like the Woodland Trust and the National Trust, which are trying to use that land that they have in support of native broadleaf forests, because of the carbon dioxide reductions, but also because of the biodiversity, the cleaner air, and the help with hydrological systems as well. So, but Bonnie, you're quite right. We need better science. Always more science is needed, and we need to inform policy in that way. Question from Ian Paul, more international on this one. How do you ensure that trees planted in the tropics today, possibly because of offsetting schemes, remain as forest and are not cleared for palm oil or other monocultures?
That's a fantastic question, and I think one that we need to be thinking about constantly, because time and again we've shown if trees are planted in an area where the local community does not have a benefit from maintaining those trees, the forest will not remain. The trees will not survive to maturity, or they will be cut down. So we need to make sure, especially and critically for international tree planting efforts, that we're working with local communities and have a way to ensure that maintaining that forest provides economic benefits. You cannot conserve forests without the support of people, and building walls around reserves doesn't work. So that's an incredibly important question, and I'm glad it was raised.
Yeah, you mentioned previously about trees being having to think about trees over 100-year type of lifestyle, and of course many trees might live for a lot. But of course, as climate changes, and if we see the worst effects of climate change, but we don't, of course, but if we do, is it possible that trees that we're planting today, that in 50 years time or 100 years time might not be suited to the climate that surrounds them? Is that a real problem?
That is a real problem, and that's one of the reasons why we advocate diversity, because there is although many scientists are working incredibly hard on trying to develop models that can predict exactly what temperature and rainfall regimes we may see in the future, those models still have substantial uncertainty. So there's not going to be one best species, for instance, for the southern UK 100 years from now. We kind of have to hedge our bet, and also rely on the ability of ecosystems to naturally adapt through physiological changes in individuals, so trees changing their strategy to obtain water and CO2, through changes in the identity of species that are there, so some will die and some will grow better, and then to the extent that we can in managed forest, ensure that the provenance or the region where the trees come from is diverse, because trees in different parts of the world have developed different toolkits to deal with environmental challenges. And so we want a broad array of those toolkits so that our trees can face whatever's coming at them in the future.
It's a real problem that we're facing in the very worst case scenario of continued ultra high emissions for the next 100 years. Is that we get into a situation where the pace of change, the rate of climate change, is so much greater than it would otherwise be through natural change. And I'm thinking about like the end of the last ice age 20,000 years ago, where things moved from being quite a lot of oscillations actually, when cold and warm as things were gradually coming out of glaciation, deep glaciation, but by and large the world warmed by about 4 degrees in 10,000 years. I mean, that's essentially what it took, and the very large boreal forests gradually started to reoccupy where ice had been, and it took all that time with massive amounts of trees that were generated. But of course the problem that we're facing with climate change is it's about 200 times quicker than that in the worst case scenario. What does that do? Does that really inhibit a tree's ability to sort of to migrate, to live in different places? Trees we're planting now just simply won't be able to cope with that type of change.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question, and it's complex because trees in different parts of the world exist. So we refer to the climate envelope of a tree species, which is the range of rainfalls and temperatures where it's happy. And some trees have a climate envelope that is big enough to encompass the predicted change that we think we're going to see, and others do not. So it's really down to the individual species whether it can tolerate what's going to happen in the future. And depending on the composition of the community, that can have really different implications for the forest as a whole. So I'll give you sort of two different examples. Here in the UK, to the best of our knowledge, the predicted changes in climate are not going to be so severe that most of our species won't survive. Some trees in the south of England may have trouble, especially with drier conditions. But for the most part, we're not predicting extinction of our native tree species over the next 100 years. If we think about the Amazon rainforest, there it's actually changes in rainfall that are the biggest challenge for trees there. And we do think it's possible that the entire ecosystem will collapse into a different state because the majority of trees there have not adapted to drier conditions, and they don't have enough time to adapt before those changes in rainfall come. So depending on the forest we're looking at, the outcomes can range from maybe the forest looking different than it does today, but retaining its essential character, to situations where we have a grassland where we once had forest.
I've got a great question from Ian Elgie here. Thank you, Ian. He says that surveys show that over, and I'm not sure how much this is true, but I'm taking your word for it, Ian. Surveys show that over 50% of mature trees can show some hollowing. Does that have an effect on their ability to capture carbon dioxide?
That's a great question. So when we are measuring trees to see how much carbon they contain, we can't cut down the tree to weigh it, obviously, because that would defeat the purpose. So what we do is we measure around the trunk, and then we make some assumptions about the width of the trunk and how tall the tree is and how dense the wood is, and therefore how much carbon it contains. These assumptions don't take into account the possibility that the inside of the tree is hollow. So there has been some discussion in the ecological community about how to accurately assess the carbon content of old forests when these very big trees may be hollow inside. I've seen some tremendously detailed work showing that yes, big trees may be hollow, and this is a thing that we need to think about in terms of assessing their carbon status, but actually really big trees tend to be adding a lot of new wood onto their branches. And so that's where the new carbon goes. And so now we need to think not only about measuring around the trunk of the tree, but maybe around the branches too. And that is a difficult feat.
Even more difficult, yeah. What causes the hollowing of a tree? What would do that?
Usually it's fungal decay, and that's part of the natural dynamic of the forest. And in fact, dead standing wood, what we call snags, and logs decomposing on the ground are really important to unmanaged forest ecosystems. They support a lot of biodiversity that can't live outside of that rotting wood.
I've got a question from Stephen Olende, who says, he's listening to the talk, thanks very much. And he mentions that that he heard that carbon sequestration from grasslands can work faster in some places than growing trees. What is the? Is that true? We should be maintaining grasslands as well?
Well, as I explained originally, we should be maintaining grasslands and ecosystems that are natively grasslands. So let's not plant trees in areas that are supposed to be prairies or grasslands. Grassland ecosystems can store a lot of carbon, mostly in their soil. So if you just think about taking a square meter of habitat, let's say you go into a grassland and cut down a square meter of grass, obviously that's just going to weigh much less than the mass of a tree in that square meter. So there is simply not as much carbon in the above ground parts of the plant in a grassland as there is in the forest. But they still can develop these really thick soil carbon horizons. And so for native grassland, it's really important that we don't disturb that soil. Generally, though, if we're looking at rate of new carbon accumulation, as I mentioned previously, soil accumulates carbon slowly. So our best bang for buck for rapid accumulation is planting trees, just because there's so much carbon in wood.
I've got a question from Lincoln Black, who says, hi from Australia. Hi, Lincoln. I said for you to join us. I'm not sure what the time is where you are. He says that, can urban food gardening assist capturing carbon? So that's not planting trees, but it's just normal gardening, perhaps with perhaps apple trees or other things. Does that help?
Not necessarily for carbon. So if you think about it, what we're seeking to do is take CO2, carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere and store it here on land so that it can't escape back. If you grow a garden, you are planting food. And so at the end of the harvest season, you'll take that food and eat it. And then through your activities, you're going to be converting that carbon in the food into carbon dioxide that you then breathe out. So urban gardens aren't maintaining a large carbon stock on land. However, they have other positive benefits for the urban farmer and for biodiversity. So it's absolutely a good thing to do. It's just not a super powerful way to store carbon.
Yes, thank you. So someone also asked about verges, the sides of roads and things, and is it a good idea to plant trees there or something else? And I was rather thinking maybe planting trees isn't the best thing, but I don't know. What do you think? There's an awful lot of land near the sides of roads. What should councils and governments be doing about that?
Well, again, so urban trees have their dominant benefits are not necessarily to carbon, but more to the local climate. So they could shade those roads. People enjoy going by trees. You would add a little bit onto the carbon storage in that urban ecosystem. But our biggest bang for buck in terms of storing carbon is probably protecting trees where they are and planting new trees in areas that are big enough to support a whole forest.
I know that on the sides of roads, a lot of councils are planting wildflowers and things like that, pollinators, encouraging bees and things. Actually, that's a good point. Bees need forests as well, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many organisms that depend on healthy forest ecosystems and forests in different states of succession, that is different ages as well. So the more forest we can protect, when I talk about forest protection, I don't just mean the very old growth pristine forests. Young regrowing forests are important too and support their own complement of biodiversity.
So we've got a very good question from Laurie Goering, who says, and this is a very topical issue, of course, and it's about the risk of fires on tree planting. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of background about, because everyone would have heard about fires and forest fires right now from Australia, but then many in California, lots of parts of the world. Is that an increasing problem? Is that something that we can mitigate? What are the issues around forest fires?
Forest fires are an increasing problem, and that's because of changes in climate, not only to the temperature, but to how much and when rain falls, which can all contribute to the intensity of fires. The degree to which we can manage it, again, depends on the ecosystem. So in California, the problem is definitely exacerbated by human interventions that have allowed too much fuel to accumulate on the landscape, the fact that people build their houses too close to those sources of fuel, and the fact that many fires in California ultimately have a human that ignites the fire, usually accidentally. If we're talking about the vast boreal forest in Canada and Russia, this is an ecosystem that is increasingly vulnerable to fire as it gets drier. And in those forests, a lot of the fires start via lightning strikes. So we can't control the lightning. Our best bet to tackle the problem of those forests drying is to keep carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, because it's the whole Earth system that is altering the climate in those places.
Just found out that unfortunately Joanne is not going to be able to join us today. We're really sorry about that. So, but we'll continue with a few more questions nonetheless. Hope you can stay with us. Question from Tom, who says that we would have heard about the trillion trees, and many people listening would have heard about this sort of trillion tree idea. What are the positive and negative issues around the trillion tree initiative?
So I think it's the Woodland Trust that has the slogan, right tree in the right place. There is no problem with the idea of planting trees per se. We've been spending the last hour talking about their benefits to the climate and to biodiversity. But it is not a simple issue to plant trees because, as we've discussed, there are places where you can plant trees that actually end up harming the climate. If you plant a non-native species, you're not getting the maximum benefits for biodiversity. So I think the potential pitfall of this trillion tree idea is an overly simplistic interpretation of that idea, where people think they need to go out and any open piece of land needs to be crammed with as many trees as possible. That is not what we want to do, and that's not the best way to realize all the benefits that come from planting trees. We always need to be thinking about the context in which we plant trees, the ecological context, so what species would be there without our intervention, and the sociological context. So after we put a tree in the ground, will it stay there? And how do we ensure that the people who are living by those trees realize the benefits from the planting?
I've got a nice question from Sudina Thappa, and she says, are there other carbon costs involved with bioenergy, such as the transport and crop harvesting? A lot of people talk about the Drax power station in Yorkshire providing carbon negative electricity. Can that be true? Is that possible? We can use bioenergy, wood pellets, to make electricity such that it can be negative with carbon capture and storage, for example.
The key thing there is with carbon capture and storage. So bioenergy, just burning wood for fuel, will return CO2 to the atmosphere. And the idea is that then growing trees take up that CO2 to form a closed cycle, so that there is no net emission of carbon over a sufficiently long time period. To get true negative emissions, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, what you need is to capture the carbon dioxide that's emitted when you burn the wood and store it someplace. So this is one of the many negative emissions technologies that are under discussion, of which tree planting is another one. And all of these technologies have their own strengths and weaknesses. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is, with current technologies, incredibly expensive, whereas planting trees is relatively cheap. So there are definitely ways to make bioenergy have a stronger impact on the climate, but it will require a lot of research and development before that's a reality.
I think we'll take one more question before we wrap up, and it's from Clara Geiger. And she asks us, what recommendation would you give to a developing country and the government so they can use carbon credits as a funding mechanism for forest conservation?
That's a really great question. And as I touched on previously, one of the main mechanisms to do so, the RED mechanism, has not shown to be effective. And so in this mechanism, one of the main problems was the funds that were gained from avoiding deforestation or planting trees were not evenly distributed to the landowners who were actually taking care of those trees. And so again, a theme that I keep returning to, if we want to protect forests and have them stay in place, we need buy-in from local communities, and that means those trees, the protection of those trees needs to be economically viable so that people aren't sacrificing income in order to protect the trees. The way to do this is going to vary, of course, depending on the country, depending on the uses for the trees, the market for timber and other wood products, for fruits and other things that come from trees. So it's really not a one-size-fits-all policy, but instead constant communication with the actual tree caretakers.
Thank you so much. And listen, thank you everybody for all the questions that you've put to us. I'm so sorry we haven't been able to get Dwayne onto this call. We're going to try again at a later date, and we'll let everyone know about that, some technical problems. but we look forward to that. Maybe he can tell us a little bit about the polar regions as well, and when he does so. So thank you, Bonnie, for answering all these questions. Do check out the paper that is linked to this YouTube channel notice. It's also on the Grantham Institute website as well. Apologies for those questions that I didn't get time to ask, but again, you can send them to us and we'll try to get them back to you. We'll try to write back to you as well. If you're interested, you can sign up to our Grantham Institute weekly update email. Things are happening quite quickly at the moment in climate science and in international aspects around it, with COP26 next year, later next year in Glasgow. You can find out all about regular things that we do at Imperial College, but also things more globally if you sign up to our email list. It's very quick, a couple of clicks, and you will get all the stuff from us to your email folder weekly. Thank you ever so much for your attention today. It's been our pleasure to talk about the role of forests and climate change with you, and we look forward to seeing you again in due course. Thank you.